Hello and welcome to the Project Hope podcast for families and friends with a loved one in a group of high demand, high control. I am your host, Jennifer. A lot has changed since I first started this podcast, so I thought I'd add a little to the initial introductions and provide something that's more up to date. I work with survivors of coercive control one-to-one. I also consult with families, and I offer education to the public around such topics. For the full scope of what I offer and also my credentials, you're welcome to check out my website, jennifer-french.com. I have a master's in the psychology of coercive control, and as of August 2024, I've been accepted into a PhD program called Psychology, Policy, and Law, and I'll have a specialty in either criminal behavior or forensic victimology. This will support the work that I currently do as an expert witness in cases involving coercive control. The Project Hope podcast has provided such an amazing opportunity for me to meet many wonderful people, survivors, experts, family members, and it's truly a pleasure to meet each one of these individuals you will hear from. This podcast will conclude with season 2 as I enter into my PhD program, but I have many other exciting things on the horizon, so please stay in touch and go to my website for any and all current events. Thanks to all of you who listen to Project Hope and care about this community. It is such a pleasure for me to introduce many of you to Ken Garrett. Before you begin this episode, I just want to provide a trigger warning regarding religious, spiritual, and sexual abuse. So please be aware of that for yourself or any young people that might be within earshot. Ken is currently the senior pastor of Grace Church, located in Portland, Oregon. He's the founder of the Spiritual Abuse Forum for Education, and he's also a member of the advisory board of ICSA, International Cultic Studies Association. Many of you have heard me refer to that a number of times, so I do recommend checking it out as an incredible resource, sort of at the forefront of cultic studies. Ken and Sharon, his wife, have 3 daughters and 4 grandchildren whom they see often. Ken has written a book called In the House of Friends, Understanding and Healing from Spiritual Abuse in Christian Churches. You will hear a little bit about the book during our discussion, but if you'd like to hear a little more, please stay tuned for the outro of this 2-part series podcast. I will be sharing a bit about what Ken says about what makes churches abusive. From 1984 until 1996, Ken and Sharon were part of an abusive church with a pastor who is still in an ongoing legal case. However, in January of 2020, so fairly recently, a jury found the pastor guilty of the sexual abuse of a minor and sentenced him to 160 months without the possibility of parole. During our interview, you'll hear that some of these details have changed, but it doesn't sound like there's a high risk of the verdict being overruled. Ken's book is a wonderful preventative resource that I would recommend for all who are or want to be part of a church community. Or if you yourself are in the ministry, this is also an excellent resource for leadership. That said, I hope you enjoy this 2-part discussion with Ken Garrett. So then, is there anything else that you'd like to share with us about the case? And I am curious, just because of being able to read about that court experience and knowing that there were some parents of girls who were in the courtroom and I think standing trial who really were not supporting their young girls, but rather were kind of in support of the pastor. And I wondered if you could just share a little bit more about that and any kind of outcome around that. Did you interact with anyone?
I really didn't, because our relationship, when I left in 96, we still had relationships, and there were other paramedics that were in the church, and we still had friendly talks and whatnot. But once it really came out clearly that we went to the police about child molesting, then the lines were really drawn. And some of those parents with their girls stayed in the cult. And then those of us that left, there was about 25 of us and about 25 that stayed. And there was really a rift then and not much communication at all until, and in 1997, the Multnomah County District Attorney heard the instances of abuse of, five or six kids, and did not pursue the case because he said, I'm not sure we could win. And at that time in history, there were some false cases that were flying around, and people getting sued for false allegations. And it just wasn't like it is now. So when my little girls, they were, not little, 12 and 10, when we brought them to the police, it's almost like they got marched into the back room with a single light bulb swinging. Yeah. And then Joe Friday, and his partner coming in and with their suits and questioning them. It was just weird. I think about that, little girls, and they're in a back room explaining. So of course they didn't say everything. They didn't want to talk about like their bodies and their genitals and him. And good grief, at 12 years old, no 12-year-old wants to talk about that with anybody, not mom and dad or a police officer though.
No, there should be a trained professional doing that with kids.
Right, which thank God there is now. But at that time, there wasn't. So I think as they started working through the case, they were feeling a little afraid about getting anywhere with it. And then parents who had stayed in the cult called the police and said, not only are the Garretts and these people that left disgruntled former members trying to disparage the character of our godly, wonderful pastor, Mike, we also resent you pulling our daughters out of class to interview them without our permission. You do not do that again, or we'll sue you. And then the daughters, of course, recanted their interviews. And these are just little girls. I mean, adolescent girls. So the DA saw this mess, kind of this hot mess, and just dropped it, which resulted in my poor daughters and all of these kids being abandoned by the system. We raise our children to go to the police when something bad happens. Well, they did that. They did everything they were supposed to do, and they got the door slammed on them at the age of 12 and 10. So you can imagine the wonderful, smooth ride of adolescence that set us up for. Oh. I mean, it was really rough for our whole family. Yeah. We felt like failures. We couldn't protect our children. Our children grew up with, I believe, somewhat of a skewed idea of authority and leadership, and had trouble trusting anybody in authority, because the people in authority not only had they abused, but the system out there secretly worked to keep them abusing. So that was rough. Yeah. But then a few years later, in 2014, an attorney who has since died, but was a wonderful man who would represent sexual abuse victims. I think his big thing was the Boy Scouts or maybe the Mormon Church or something. Anyway, just a wonderful lawyer. What's his name? Kelly. Anyway, they went and saw him because they heard him on NPR doing an interview, and he was in town. So one of the girls went and said, this isn't right. We went to the police, we did everything, and now we're all in our 20s and we're all in various stages of being really screwed up. And they're posting online and going on their trips, and he's up there preaching, and this is not right. So this lawyer, genius, he said, let's go report it to the police. And she
Wow.
said, well, we did when we were kids, or at least my kids said that. And he said, no, let's go file again. So they walked down to the Portland police precinct in downtown Portland, went up to the front desk and said, we want to report a crime, a sexual abuse crime. And the cop sitting behind the desk said, all right, what date, what's your name, and all that. And then they said, between 1990 and 94 or something like that. And he said, well, that, you mean 10 years ago?
Yeah.
And they said, yeah. So he said, you need to go upstairs and talk to the detective at sexual crimes. By this time, Portland had changed, man. This was a woman detective, a woman DA, or assistant DA, women lawyer. And in other words, I'm not saying a man couldn't empathize or relate, but you know what I mean. Things are different, man.
Yeah.
It's like the women warriors are coming out and saying, I'm not going to let any girls get, the shaft on my watch. So they picked up the case, reinvestigated, and they found that there was one girl who it was still within the statute of limitations. And they conducted the entire case. It was real hit and miss if it was even going to work. But then the day came where they arrested the guy and pressed charges, and he was put away for 20 years for felony sexual assault.
Wow.
Then came the appeals and whatnot, which of course had put us on quite a strange road. But no doubt that he's an abuser. No doubt he's a pedophile. And there's no doubt they're going to go to court again, because like the DA has said, we are simply not going to walk away from a serial pedophile and just say, oh, it looks like he outlasted us. So wonderful things happened. And that's kind of where we're at with it. Along the way, I had completed seminary training. I did become a pastor, and I've been at my church for almost 20 years now, and I love it. I love my friends there that I serve. And then I went back and studied for a doctorate. And my area of study was on abuse as it happens in Christian churches, evangelical Christian churches, and that was my dissertation, which, like I told you yesterday, too long, too many words, too boring. but I boiled it down into the book House of Friends, which is really just a distillation of my work and studying in my doctoral course.
Yeah. Thank goodness.
Yeah. I thank you.
Well,
yeah.
Might this be a good moment I really wanted, just for our listeners, I thought it might be helpful if I just kind of read through the table of contents so that they have an idea of kind of what they're getting.
Yeah, cool.
This is one of those books that I really felt like, if we read through the chapters, then the audience just has an idea of what the contents are.
Thank you.
So chapter 1, cults and churches. Chapter 2, spiritual abuse, ... in the Bible, ? The third chapter is abusive pastors, how they tick, how they talk, the mindset, the speech. So those are very helpful, I think. Chapter 4, who would ever join an abusive church? Then inside the abusive church. And I did want to just read kind of the segments of inside the abusive church. You've got deception, loss, isolation, elitism, fear, disclosure or confession, trauma. And then you move into chapter 6 with healing. And then I love that chapter 7 is when the walking wounded walk into church. And this is the chapter I would just recommend for any and everyone who's in kind of a position of spiritual authority of any sort to really understand what they might encounter when they're welcoming people into their church who have had really negative experiences. So that's amazing. Because I actually, Ken, I haven't come across, maybe a little in like article research that I've done, but I really haven't come across anything that just clearly lays it out in the way that you have, that's just so accessible. So I'll say on that note, I mean, my hope for this book also is that it's very much used by churches.
Thank you.
And then chapter 8, the pastor as a safe shepherd. And then chapter 9, safe churches. So they're honest, they don't pressure, they encourage healthy friendships with non-Christians, respecting other churches, encouraging self-confidence and independent thinking, handle confession appropriately, kind, respectful to members who leave, and saturation with grace. Yeah, and then you also give in that final chapter some final thoughts for families and friends. And I figured probably in the outro, I'll go ahead and take a little segment from the book and just work off of that. So I am really just so appreciative of this book, that it exists, and what you've done with it, Ken, is really so lovely. And the book itself is quite tiny. We can't show people because we're audio, but just really accessible in that way. And as Ken mentioned, very succinct. Ken, what was it like for you to write the book, put it out there, and what's been your experience with that?
Yeah, it was really quite an experience. The dissertation work was a year of writing, and of course, all of the rigors of writing. And I love to write, but I don't love to write books. I've never written a book, so it was a whole new world for me. And then in putting together the book, I was almost in a mode of just chopping out all kinds of material that did not seem relevant. And my guiding principles were that I wanted this to be a very accessible book for people who had left their abusive churches. I wanted to write something that somebody could leave their abusive church, and as soon as they're done crying and wanting to interact with it a little bit, you could put this book in their hands, and it wouldn't be like many of the academic oriented books that are like about 20 pounds and you got to want to study this, but that it would just be a book that immediately tells them, as a Christian, as an author, I get it. And I'd like for you, I think you can finish this book in less than an hour. And I just want to introduce you to the concept that you didn't do anything wrong. There's a whole science out there about what this pastor did to you. He is not creative. He is not an amazing angel of darkness, that are not at all. He is in the same basket as about 10 billion other narcissistic dweebs that hurt people. And so I just want you to read this book and know that you're not alone. I mean, whether it was the Greek philosophers or Christianity or the sociological studies that have gone on in American universities, they're all well aware of this person. He or she even has a name in the psychological journals and whatnot. I just wanted to try to normalize the experience, because people come out of these groups oftentimes having been compromised financially, sexually, their family, and they carry such deep shame with them that these aren't the kind of things that you just go into work the next day and go, oh yeah, by the way, I was sleeping with my pastor, a couple of times, and oh yeah, by the way, I helped him get some Vicodin once, and you of course you're ashamed, and so I wanted to write something, and this is what drove me, that would serve as somewhat of an apologetic for my life and why a person that was just kind of a normal Joe Blow would end up jettisoning all of his childhood friends and alienating his family and putting his children through these horrible experiences and letting his marriage just, really get in trouble. I wanted my own way to explain myself, and then to um, introduce the idea to people that perhaps something happened to them
Yeah.
more than they did something.
Yes.
And then secondly, I just wanted to put this book into the hands primarily of the family and friends of people who have joined these groups.
Yeah.
So parents who may or may not be Christian and raise their daughter, and they send her off to college, and can't wait for her to get home for Christmas break, But then she calls and says, "Oh, I don't know if I'm going to be home. The League of Youthful Christ Followers is taking the whole break to go down to the beach, and we're going to study through the whole Gospel, of Luke or something." You're hearing something that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
It's Bible study. You think it's going to be okay, but wow, do you really have to miss Christmas with your family? I mean, really?
Yeah.
And then, of course, she tells you, "Mom, I thought you were a spiritually minded person. Yeah, I want to grow. Is that okay?" And it causes so much trouble. I just wanted a book that I could put in the hands of those family members so that I could tell them, "No, you're not failures. It's not your fault.
Yeah.
Somebody very, very powerful came into the life of your wonderful daughter or son. Here's how you can understand their situation and maybe even become a loving and dear part of their life that can be a bridge for when they leave, because they most likely are going to leave. They're going to be burned out, crushed up, wadded up, and thrown by the wayside. And when that happens, maybe instead of them going to a hotel because they're ashamed, maybe you can have the kind of relationship where they know that actually their bedroom's right there."
Yeah.
And that there's a place for them and the kids, and you can be a positive part of it without alienating and fighting them. And so I had hoped in this book to provide some explanation to help people that are kind of from the outside watching and scratching their heads.
Well, you certainly did. So thank you so much for that. I'm really looking forward to recommending the book, and I'm so grateful that it's out there.
Thank you. Thanks.
And just because I assume our listeners may want to know, because I already kind of know the answer to this, but do you mind just sharing a little bit about where you're all at now, that you actually have a relationship with the kids and
The
you and
rest of
Sharon
the
are
story.
together?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm delighted with my family. I love them. And trust me, they're all different than me. It's not that we have all the same beliefs or anything like that. I don't evaluate it that way. I just have children that love me, and I love them. And I love their husbands, boyfriends, children, and all that. I have four grandchildren, and I like to say six grandchildren because two of them were from a prior relationship that came into my daughter's life. But since my granddaughter in that relationship is like 21, I don't think she wants a creepy Grandpa Ken suddenly, guess what? I'm your grandpa. So I joke about that, but I'll start at the bottom and just say I have these grandchildren, and I love them dearly, and so we're happy. I see them every chance I get. And my daughters, there's three of them. There's Brinny, who's 37, going to be 37. Rachie, who is 36. And these are the two older girls that were in the cult with me and pursued the legal thing with the pastor. And then Gracie, who is 26. We left when she was just an infant, a baby. And Gracie's away a lot because she's studying, and she's home now for the summer, which is cool. But she's away at school in Vienna, so she's living the life there, and that's kind of cool.
Ooh, is she into the arts or?
No, she's majored in Eurasian
Oh,
Central Asian Studies, lived in Kazakhstan, and she's working on a master's about the uh, political relations between Russia and Kazakhstan, and also exploring issues of genocide and nationalism, and some of the interplay.
oh,
So
fascinating.
I probably didn't explain that right. She would probably go, "Dad," but that's where she's at. And then my middle girl, Rachie, she works for Adidas and has been with them for quite a while, and is something like an accounts manager that she does with them. And she has 3 children, and her husband Aaron. We're besties because we live just a few miles apart. So it's pretty great
Oh,
to
what
see my kids.
fun.
Yeah, and I love them. I love nothing more than sitting having breakfast with my daughters and having coffee or something. And I love them. And then my daughter Brinny, she's my oldest girl. She lives in Eugene, which is a couple hours south of here,
Yeah.
with her fiance and Troy, and they have a little girl who's Scout, and Scout is about November. She was born in November, so I guess she's coming up on 6 or 7 months now. So yeah, I mean, we're doing really good as a family. We had some rough years because when you leave as a family, I was telling my youngest daughter this a few months ago. One of the things you have to look back on and realize that I missed is that you, Gracie, although we left when you were a little baby, you grew up in a home with 4 cult survivors who were insane. I mean, we didn't get much counseling help. So you grew up in a home, and I realized a lot of the things you experienced were some of the acting out and unfinished business of a person with post-traumatic or complex post-traumatic
Yeah.
insults to their care and to their lives. And so we had our rough times growing up, definitely. But at the end of the day, I believe we live as a very loving family. We don't hold each other to religious demands or anything. Does that make sense? It's not
Yeah.
like my kids have to go to my church
Mm-hmm.
or believe what I believe, or like it's really important to me that they don't believe certain Christian things and do others. We don't even go there
Yeah.
unless they're interested in talking to Dad and seeing what I might think. But
Right.
other than that, I just want my kids to like me and want to hang out with me. And I'm totally cool with that. Um,
Parent goals.
that is the grand total. And we read all of the books. I mean, we tried and we did all of that, but you can't violate a child's conscience. You can't be unfair about what you demand they become. You love them and you demonstrate a model what you hope that they love.
Yeah.
So we're doing okay with all of that. And then my role as an advocate has changed through the years. I joined the International Cultic Studies Association years ago when I started my doctoral studies. I decided I kind of wanted to go off the religious reservation a little bit because Christianity seemed to treat abusive churches and pastoral clergy abuse and those things. It seemed to treat it often as if it were a devotional spiritual issue where you can read the Bible and study the Bible and join a prayer group and do these things to save, to salvage or to respond. And I began to suspect that this issue had much more to do with pathological psychiatric problems and predatory behavior, and that perhaps the church really was a bunch of sheep, and that if a wolf could or a shepherd could get in there wearing the uniform of a shepherd, he could just pick the sheep apart. And I started looking at the Bible a new way and then also studying differently. So I joined ICSA and met some great people in that and started seeing myself as somebody who might be able to help others. And
Yeah.
after wrestling through it for a few years, I started a monthly meetup
Yeah.
where it's not a support group. It is a a group that we haven't met during COVID, but it's a group where you come and we will always have some discussion about this issue of spiritual abuse. I have a couple of partners in it that are great people doing it with me. And then we'll have some talking time, and it'll be really low key. There's no expectation. There's no, okay, we're going to close this group. I hope cult members would come to this group. We're going to be that friendly and cool about the whole thing. If you come and you are, that you were abused, but you still believe a lot of that stuff about white supremacy that you believed, as abhorrent as that is, I want you to come to our group.
Yeah.
Because we can be friends and start talking. And I hope I can change your mind, really. But I'm not going to hate you before you come in. So I've tried to create it to where we are that open and available to everybody. So we meet once a month, or we were meeting once a month, and we were meeting at a huge, beautiful pub. It's a pub that basically McMinimans is like our incredible microbrew people up here, and they buy these great old buildings and make them into pubs. So the Kennedy School is an old elementary school in Portland, and now you've got like 4 bars there, some really nice restaurants, a theater, a soaking tub, hotel room. It's just a really cool place.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's like a tourist stop kind of place where you definitely would want to go. And so we meet in a room there, a donated community room for our meetups. And through that, we end up having some wonderful friends that have joined us from a variety of backgrounds that involve spiritual abuse, not only Christian, but also the whole gamut of Christian denominations and groups. And then also other groups that are traditionally seen as cultic, such as Jehovah's Witness or Latter-day Saints, particularly fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. And I don't say that to say they're cults, because to me, a cult's a place that treats people a certain way, but their belief systems are just different than your Orthodox Christianity, right?
Yeah.
They're some women who have grown up with multiple mothers in the house and one man who was the dad. And so some pretty tricky things. And then some of what we would call new age groups with different modern understandings of spirituality that go sideways when they start controlling people's lives. Yeah. And some yoga cults from the local area that take something like yoga and turn it into the way of controlling. So by the time somebody kind of comes to one of our meetups, they have to get a beer on the way in the door. I mean, how else are you going to do it? But they end up, and also some really extreme fundamentalist groups in the area too. Yeah. But their survivors come and basically just find a place where nobody will look at you like you've got horns growing out of your head, and your story is something that you kind of feel like they maybe just want to go get on their phone to say, you wouldn't believe it. There's a girl here who's 18 children and 5 mothers. We want to have a group that's safe enough that you're really surrounded by people that care, and people come and go through it. Some people come once, they don't come back. Some come every week. Some I see every few months. I wanted it to be that kind of just an open market kind of feel. Yeah. And that's what we do. What we do now to try to help cult survivors in our area.
Yeah, that's so fabulous, Ken. And I know you're, very connected into that community. In fact, for those of you who are familiar with Michael Langone, he did write the foreword to Ken's book, and it's excellent, by the way. I really loved what he said. Yeah. In fact, there was one quote here that I could read that I was fascinated by. He said, approximately 70% of those entering the ICSA network, or some of you may know it as ICSA. I'm never quite sure, Ken, what to call it. Do you know?
I call it ICSA.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. They're struggling if that's even the right name, but ICSA.
Okay. That's International Cultic Studies Awareness Network. So 70% of those entering this network were harmed in religious groups. The other 30% were harmed in cultic psychotherapies, political groups, New Age transformational trainings, commercial organizations, or families or dyads characterized by a cultic dynamic. And I found that fascinating because I'm kind of living under the assumption that within most Christian cultures, that word cult just doesn't seem to really be affiliated or associated because I assume because it has a historical context and legitimacy called Christianity. That I was very surprised to hear that statistic. And it did make me think, because your book was recently written, I wondered if that was, an old stat or a new stat, and just curious about kind of that ratio present day.
Yeah.
It's really, and maybe we won't know it, until more comes out within the organized church communities.
Yeah. I think, and Langoni's, Michael Langoni's work, and he is just a wonderful man and a friend that I trust. And so I think he's done other work that says about 2% of people in Christian churches have experienced spiritual abuse.
Oh, yes. I actually did come across that.
That's really interesting. And I found that to be true, which means in my church, I just have a small church here in Portland, maybe 70 people. So what does that mean? I'm going to have a person in there that was abused, 1.5 people. But I've got more than that. So I even wonder if it's higher than 2%. But the point about the 70% coming from religious abuse is fascinating, because not only that the 30% involves other areas like politics, military, entertainment, music, culture, business, multi-level marketing.
We're forgetting, Ken, health and wellness too, like the yoga and in retrospect, I've come to realize after my cult, I think I attended about 5 other cults.
Yeah, exactly. And I was always being recruited by cults. And there was just something about me that was pretty vulnerable, I guess. The health and wellness. And the thing is, I didn't quite realize it. It's Harvey Weinstein. It's the military. It's the general who grooms and sleeps with his orderly. It's the president who abuses an intern in his office. It's all of these forms. These are not aberrant forms of romantic attachment. Yeah. These are grooming, emotional manipulation and deceit and control. So I'm fascinated by the 30%, but I have to note that the 70% really represents, sadly, a growing number. In the 1960s, the cultic world involved, there were a few of these Christian cults out there, but people didn't know about much of anything else. Every priest was a saint. No coach would ever, there's no Sandusky's out there. And gymnastic coaches were just committed to young ladies excelling as gymnasts. One crazy illusion after another.
Yep.
That's all gone now, and rightly so. And what is coming out now is that the spiritual world is the largest doorway and pathway that the narcissistic abusive leader is going through to get to people's bodies, money, power, lives, and everything. Now, with 350,000 churches in America, that's really a pretty sweet deal for a narcissist, a predator to go for. And with these organizations, by and large, awarding money and prestige based on speaking ability. Yeah. If you are able to stand in front of a group of people and pick up the Bible, which I have found to be a very, very powerful and I would even call it a living book, and you can stand up there and hold that and communicate powerfully to people, you just have this easy pathway to them. So the 70%, I believe, is growing. And within ICSA, it's growing with Christians.
Wow.
And they're trying to figure out what to do. I mean, quite honestly, they arose out of the Eastern invasion of cults, the Krishna, the this, the that,
Yeah.
and the Bhagwan back in the 80s.
Yep.
That was in my neighborhood. So, I mean, they arose as a response to that. But now they've got mainline and smaller evangelical and fundamentalist churches that are practicing mind control, totalism, all the stuff that we just thought those chanting Moonies and Krishnas were doing.
Right.
They're doing the same kinds of violation on people. And so ICSA is evolving. It's an organization that is not Christian, and most of its members and therapists are not Christian, and yet it is being deluged by Christian survivors of abuse in the churches.
Yeah.
So it's a changing landscape.
Wow. So let me ask you this. I'm curious, do you feel that, see, I was sort of under the impression that it's just coming out now. Do you feel that, I mean, certainly we have stories historically of spiritual abuse and sexual abuse in the churches.
Sure.
Do you think that that's kind of always been as prevalent as it is now and it's just coming out now? Or do you think that there's actually been an increase in kind of predatory manipulation or individuals being attracted?
That's a really good question.
And maybe we just don't know. I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot there, but.
Oh, no, it's okay. It's just, there is I mean, you've just articulated a monstrous possibility, and that's that this stuff has always gone on.
Yeah.
And we know, everybody who's ever got an honest talk with mom or aunt or grandma or whatever, we know that sexual abuse was covered over, not recognized, or even joked and laughed about.
Yeah.
In many instances, and we're horrified now to think of the ways we treated, especially women statistically, but also boys and men. Yeah. And so it's a horrible specter to think that our organizations have always had this in it. But you know what? When I think back to my years growing up, when I was in the 70s and 80s, there were predators that hit on me. I just was lucky that I didn't get caught. But I look back to conversations and behaviors that were so absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
And that I knew something wasn't right. So I think there's a good possibility that it's always been there.
Yeah.
And I wish I could say that now that the cat's out of the bag and the Me Too movement and everything, that our world's going to be a safer place. Except predators, especially, and I don't just mean a pastor or an imam or a leader who falls into impropriety, a non-criminal form of impropriety with sex or drugs or something like that. He or she probably should be out of their job and position. They should not be providing spiritual direction when they have abused their group like that. That should be a career ender, at least for a long, long time. Okay, but I'm not talking about them, but the predators within the group. And they're always going to figure out how to play the rules in order to get what they want.
Yes.
So the whole movement, for instance, about, how are we going to keep these pastors in line? Accountability partners. That's going to fix it. You will meet with a group of 4 pastors once a week, and you will answer these questions. Have you related to anybody in your church, any woman wrongly? Have you looked at any images in the screen or your computer or whatever? Have you done this, and this? And the last question is, have you lied to me? Okay. That approach, which was popular back in the 80s and 90s, that approach assumes that predators don't lie. Of course they lie. And of course they say, oh no, I haven't. Oh no, I'm not lying to you right now. I love you, man. Thank you for being my accountability partner. So this particular personality type, like what I've written about in my book, um, while I think it's so important to combat them and respond to them, I think it begins with building healthy relationships in the home so that we're always talking, always knowing what our experience is with our kids and whatnot. And then always knowing that they are the smartest guys in the room. And we gotta not think we're smarter. I know that sounds really dumb.
That is
But
brilliant, because
don't think you're
we
smarter.
miss that. Yeah.
Yeah. How many people have said to you when you've told your experience, well, did you think about doing this?
Right.
And or with me, they'll say, well, didn't you kind of wonder when this and this and this and this happened?
Yeah.
And what I want to say is, no, because he's so smart that he took over my brain and my wife's brain and emotions.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are really those kinds of people in our culture. They're not listening to this podcast because they don't care, but trust me, they're proud of their ability to do that.
Yeah.
You don't want them speaking in court. They just might still have enough spark to them to get out. So that's monstrous. And so, in answer to your first, question, Jennifer, is, yeah, I'd like to think that it's just bad now so that we could fix it now. Kind of like a fast growing cancer, you can get it fixed right away. And so sometimes that can be the best kind to have. But looking back on the scriptures, what Ezekiel wrote, what the prophets wrote, what Jesus said about these wolves, beware of them. What Paul said, after my departure, wolves will arise within this church from within and without, seeking to draw away. And what Peter said about unreasoning, instinctual beasts who will attack this church, false prophets. And Jude wrote at the end of it. And John about there are many antichrists. That just means instead of Christs out there today. So I do know that 2,000 years ago, this issue in my faith tradition as a Christian, this issue was on the front burner then.
Yeah.
So I have no reason to think that it's ever been dealt with or put on or rightfully put on a back burner.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because I actually just realized as I was envisioning a slide that popped into my mind, I realized actually, Ken, that I think I saw you in this conference that was put on by ICSA, and it was about narcissism.
Where was it at?
It was online, and it was a number of weeks ago. And I think I actually saw you there. But it's interesting because I was thinking of it. So I saw this slide in my head. But it's very interesting, this whole topic, also because, of course, we talk about kind of the continuum of influence in the same way, sort of these degrees and categories of narcissism, where they're, it's truly what they call the malignant narcissist that is thinking in this way, where it's all very purposeful, versus somebody who maybe got into it with kind of good intentions and then just power and control and whatever else took over. And it's very confusing. It's very confusing. And I think that's an unanswered question for many people who have been in relationship with narcissists. How intentional was the damage? How conscious was the damage? And I know for me personally, I still kind of have a bit of a linger around that question with the leader that I was involved with. And this actually led me to this concept that I just heard, and I have to give credit to the source. It was actually in this new documentary that's been released about Andrew Cohen, who was this spiritual teacher in the US and who is now kind of trying to be a spiritual teacher again. And a couple of his followers who were very engaged with him have been on the podcast, Joel and Laura Pitney. And this documentary was just recently released. I think it's a 4-part series. And one of the guys that is in the documentary, along with Joel, who I know is a good friend of his, has this quote that was fascinating to me. It was sort of this new twist on things for me personally. And you know what he said, Ken? He said that there are probably people who really do have spiritual kind of gifts, shall we say. And these people start these groups, they get followers, people are deepening spiritually, having spiritual experiences. So the whole buy-in to the experience happens. Yeah. But what I found fascinating is he said, but then what happens in these groups is the leader ends up running your life, right? So like in my group, for example, as with Andrew Cohen group, as with, it sounds like your group as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Finances are being run by the leader. Phone calls. I mean, I was told that I shouldn't be opening letters from my parents anymore. So I started doing return to sender, and then I'd sneak them every once in a while.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
did you eat what they wanted you to eat?
Oh, yes. So our leader had a thing about eggs for breakfast. So every single breakfast with him, we had to have eggs. Now, God knows why none of us were even able to think outside the box to go, that sounds like attachment to me. And we're not allowed to be attached to anything. So why does he get to have his eggs every single morning? Any of us that demanded eggs every single morning, oh, that would have been nipped in the bud right away, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, the hypocrisy, of course, is endless and goes on and on. But what I found fascinating that this guy said, he goes, you know, maybe there are people who really do kind of have spiritual gifts and are spiritual, and they're functioning on that plane. And it's kind of a different place to even exist and live in your being and to exist in the world in that vibe, for lack of a better term. That's not the person you want advising you about life matters. In fact, they don't even know about a lot in life. They don't know how business works. They don't know how jobs work. Now, if they have the narcissistic streak, I'm sure they're just doing research on, you know, it's very clear to me post-cult that my leaders were seriously tuned in to the internet or books or other people's teachings and regurgitating the whole thing. And that's actually, you know, I thought that they were wise, but actually all those principles had already been taught before.
Yeah.
So I thought, you know, it was just an interesting kind of twist for me of considering these leaders who are doing the spiritual thing and going, maybe they really are sort of just in a little bit of a different world that's a little weird. You know, it's not that grounded in if you're living sort of a full, well-rounded life in quote unquote the world.
That's a really good point. And here's what, in our case, the leader didn't ever do anything that he might not look good at. So we tried to bring him fly fishing one week, and it was just laughable. We practically, we were like, you know, Noah's sons turning our back with the blanket to Noah's naked body to not shame him. We didn't want to look at him getting the fly all tangled up in his hair and the bushes, you know. And it was, what was so terrible about it was that he only would do things in front of people that he could excel at, like speak of his knowledge of sports, his, you know, street savvy, this and that. And it was within minutes of reeling in our flies, because we weren't going to keep doing that, because now he had pronounced fly fishing was really stupid and unspiritual.
Yeah. Right.
So He was just in a different place. And then food wise, of course, because we're living communally. Good grief! Why did it have to be hamburger and cans of cream of mushroom soup? I mean, what? Why couldn't it have been? You know.
Oh, I know. I know. I mean, at some point I was told not to exercise. So it's the only time in my entire life where I wasn't physically
Uh,
active for about 8 years. I mean, they let me get my running in for about 2 years, but then I was shamed for being too body conscious. And that's why I was running, which
yeah, that was very selfish of you, Jennifer. I got caught running too because I just gotten out of the army, and good grief, you run every day, all day. I mean, so I'm running to just keep my life in order. But you know what? Bodily discipline profits nothing.
yeah.
And so I started running like before the sun came up. You know?
Running in secret.
Yeah, I didn't want anybody to see that I was, doing that. But the continuum thing is true, and
Yeah.
they do abuse on a continuum, and I think Steve Hassan really unpacks that a little bit with a particular chart he's used. But um, it's also true, I believe anyway, according from my beliefs, that they are in a different spiritual existence. They have crossed a line, and the line, I don't even know if they know when they crossed it, but I know what it looked like. It looked like the time they did something that was wrong, that they were good at, and they stopped feeling bad about it, and they decided they were just going to live with it
Mm,
because, God seems to be taking care of them anyway. They're still able to preach. They do what they do want, and God hasn't struck them dead. And it's really best if everybody does what they say anyway, since they have a better world in mind for everybody. All of those, stupid thoughts of violation, um, those are what starts happening when they cross that line. And the thing about what I believe about spiritually, when you allow or create a spiritual vacuum, it is a vacuum, and something fills it.
yeah.
And so, if you're a leader who is using a religious belief system and you're using it for evil and wrong and bad, you're creating this vacuum. In other words, an emptiness. And I believe in Satan. I believe in the devil, and I believe there's malevolent spiritual forces at work in the world. I think they fill that, and they do it in the way they do things best, as angels of light. They do it looking good, and they do it with good and not good intention, but you know,
The right
they
language maybe around the
yeah,
intention. Yeah.
yeah. It's a lot easier to get into people's souls that way. So it is a continuum, but I also believe what you're saying is spot on. That there is a spiritual component that's different than us. It's a different plane. Uh, um, And I don't believe these guys stay on that plane. I think they lose their stuff. They get weak. They start out street smart, and then as their lives go on, their bodies begin to deteriorate. They're unable to live with the level of stress that being a narcissist brings into your life. And they start culling the herd so that they have a smaller group of people they control
Yeah.
and basically die unfulfilled and miserable and mostly unrepentant.
Mm,
They do not get long in the tooth and reach the end of their days and say, folks, I just want to come clean.
yeah.
It was all a joke. I just wanted to buy a house. They don't do that. They go to their grave, and in the particularly malicious ones, they take their people with them, and
Yeah.
that's the serious business part of this thing.
Yep. So true. That's where my ex-leader currently is at, where he's got a crew of about, my guess is somewhere between like around 20 people minus children, and they're all completely isolated. And when I think about him and I go, if all those people left him, what would he have and how would he even survive? I mean, because that entire community supports him, of course. He doesn't work. And I just really, when I think about that, I go, he has been so detached from having any real responsibility because he's just got this following that I think he's just so far gone now from reality. I don't even know if those people really walked away and the whole thing crumbled for some blessed reason.
Yeah.
I really wonder if he'd be able to survive and kind of what he'd even do. Or maybe he'd be like, some of the others that just try to pick up and find a new crew of followers.
Yeah.
Uh,
The end is coming for my group too, because they're not recruiting younger people. They've lost their stuff. Their physical health, isn't so great, and they're a lot of old people. And I believe what is probably happening is that the group is just becoming a support network of physical and financial care for the main pastor and his immediate family and friends, and that they're all of the resources of these 20 people that are left, all their money, their time, good grief that some of them have lost their children and their friends and all this. It's all going to go into making sure he is cared for until he dies.
Yeah.
And that is how it ends up working. These are leaders who at no point in their life give life or bless others. Everything is transactional, and everything flows toward them. Nothing to the members. So, bad stuff.
Oh, Ken, well, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. And I'm so grateful that, so much of what we talked about is in this book and that it's available to others to just digest in their own time and space and way. And it's such a pleasure to know you, Ken. Thank you. I just, couldn't thank you enough. And thank you also, of course, for being on this sort of unique mission of open dialogue around, around the abusive stuff.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. And Jennifer, you reached out to me and honored me by letting me come on here and talk at you, and you didn't fall asleep or anything, which is an experience of many pastors.
Hardly. Well, I can't imagine that you have that problem, Ken.
Oh, well, you should visit, because I do, and it's fine. I figure people only fall asleep where they're comfortable, right? But, Jennifer, I just want to thank you for your work and for letting me into your world, and praise God for that, and bless you, because you're really one of a kind. I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. So a big thanks to those of you who are joining us for part 2 with Ken Garrett, and we are picking up from our part 1 outro, where we're discussing some of the 7 what I've labeled as guideposts that Ken has laid out for us in terms of what makes a church abusive. So we are going to finish that list, and as we dive into that, our next topic is fear. So members of abusive churches are afraid of displeasing their leaders. Abusive churches are spiritual communities of fear. This fear is a mechanism of control, for members are increasingly motivated not by a desire to please their abusive pastors, but by the fear of displeasing them. A complex system of rewards and punishments is gradually applied to the life of the members, making them vulnerable to manipulation. The fear of displeasing the abusive pastor makes members say things they don't believe and do things they don't desire to do. But to refuse their guidance and directives brings displeasure. So church members in the grips of such abuse go out of their way to demonstrate the exclusive loyalty and submission expected by their leader. It is not surprising that living in such a state of fear creates great anxiety and fear in these members of abusive churches, despite the outer superficial appearance that they are quite happy and satisfied. Our next guidepost, disclosure. Abusive churches require indiscriminate
intrusive confession from members. Harmful churches tend to coerce confessions of sin and failure out of their members. In this delicate, precarious area of members' souls, the deepest wounds are inflicted, and often are the wounds that take the longest to heal. So Ken describes confession in terms of Christianity as the acknowledgement of sin and failure. So, in a sense, confession is simply speaking the truth to oneself, to God, and to anyone else one chooses to share with. Confession is not a quick route to spiritual maturity or wisdom, but as an acquired habit of life, it becomes a path that leads to those things. Of course, abusive churches don't see it that way. In the church that abuses, the confession of sin, whether actual or imagined, is wrung out of members as a means of gaining emotional control over them. Such coerced confessions strengthens the control that abusive pastors hold over church members. Not content to simply hear members' confessions of their sins, abusive leaders proceed to extract their innermost thoughts and feelings, which violates what is often members' last safe place, their conscience. This practice has 3 damaging effects on the life of the church. It empowers the abusive pastor, it damages the member, and it weakens relationships among fellow members of the congregation. Forced confession introduces a mythical perception of abusive leaders, creating the appearance that such leaders possess a deeper level of insight and wisdom beyond that of the group members. Simply suggesting to members that there is something there to confess is unsettling to them, for almost everyone has something they can find that is deficient in their faith and in need of addressing. So Ken actually provides some examples here, and he states that it soon became apparent that no answer or confession could assure his pastor of Ken and his wife's loyalty to both him and his ministry. But, as Ken says, his goal was not to uncover anything of what any of them felt or thought. It was more sinister, to break the wills of the members through violating their most intimate, private thoughts. Once broken, repentant, apologetic members were graciously forgiven by the pastor, and the group quickly followed and affirmed affection for the humbled, broken individuals. The sessions ended in exhaustion, tears, and hugging, an experience that Lifton called, quote, an orgiastic sense of oneness. We were trauma bonding, gaining a deep sense of closeness and identification with one another through having faced ongoing cycles of emotional punishment, confession, breaking, and reward. Naturally, coerced confession inflicts horrible damage on the lives of the members of the abusive church, leaving deep, indelible scars. Lifton refers to this self-revealing, self-condemning ritual as the cult of confession. In their earliest experience of confession in the church, members may initially find the coerced, indiscriminate bearing of their souls to be agreeable and even beneficial. Through confession, they may find personal purification from sin or powerful identification with the church membership. They may experience acceptance and the perception of forgiveness of their sins. They may even find temporary relief from the free-floating sense of guilt and shame that we often carry through life. But whatever positive experiences of confession that a member may have found, soon are exposed for their conditional nature. The member will experience acceptance and supposed understanding as he continues to confess even more deeply and intimately his sin and failures. And unlike healthy confession, the coerced confession of the abusive church leaves its members vulnerable, unprotected, and with the lasting wounds of emotional violation. Coerced confession is a violation of the trust, courtesy, and acceptance that should mark a healthy congregation. When members tolerate confession used as a tool against their fellow members, they act as unwitting assistants to the abusive leader. They also become desensitized to the mistreatment of their fellow members. Coerced confession creates a false non-community in which the unconditional acceptance and love inherently promised to members upon joining is subtly replaced with a conditional acceptance, one that depends on members enduring emotional humiliation to maintain their sense of belongingness in the group. When the confession is perverted in this way, and admission of sin, failure, and unworthiness are emphasized more than forgiveness, grace, and the genuine joy of being accepted by God, then the church has become a cult of confession. And our last guidepost, trauma. Abusive churches use fear, obstacles, and punishments to prevent members from leaving. The trauma of leaving an abusive church begins before members actually walk out the door, and usually continues long after they have been free of the church. Active members are besieged with threats of the doom, the loss, and the divine disfavor that awaits those who dare to leave the church. And they truly will experience trauma when they finally do leave. It is often while they are still in the church that members come to understand very clearly how difficult leaving might be. They may hear warnings about the foolishness of leaving, the likelihood of divine displeasure dogging them for the rest of their days, the certainty of personal catastrophe, and the loss of their friends. They may be told that their marriage won't survive, or that their children might get sick, or may well end up as juvenile delinquents. Abusive pastors often mock and deride members who have left the church. And again, Ken goes into some quotes and some examples. I'll give a couple of those that could be the messages couched in criticism of those who have left. So things like, Robert would rather make money than make disciples. Jim struggled with spiritual authority and decided to go it alone. He wants his own church so he can be in charge. Susan would rather party than follow the Lord. I'm sure we have some audience members who can relate to that. But the reason for the nastiness is not simply to express disdain for the members who left. Its purpose is to make an impact on those who remain. Cutting down those who leave an abusive church communicates to those members who remain that should they leave the church, they too will be spoken and thought of in such disparaging and disrespectful ways. And the put-downs and derision will come from the lips of those whom they considered their friends in the church. This keeps many abused people in abusive churches for years. For despite the abuse and absurdity of life in an abusive church, the members are your closest friends after all. This is how the trauma involved in leaving the abusive church begins before members even walk out the door. Many members who leave abusive churches continue to experience trauma from their experiences for months and years afterward. The depth of emotional, psychological pain inflicted in such treatment makes recovery from the abusive church much more difficult and extended. Of even greater intensity is the trauma experienced by those children who are born into or raised in the abusive church and then decide to leave it as teens or as adults. And again, in Ken's own words, he says, "In my experience, the very least effect of their decision to exit results in a general discomfort and coolness from their parents, and the most extreme result is total rejection of the child by the parent. Years after my departure, I heard the stories of several former members of my church who had run away from the church-led homes in which they'd been raised. Out of fear and the certainty of rejection and conflict, they did not discuss their decision to leave even with their parents. Of those now young adults that I am friends with who grew up in my church, none were pursued or contacted by their parents after running away. This is the model that children in such churches grow up observing, fearing, and choosing, rather than continuing in the impossible, irrational, harsh world of a church that lives as a destructive cult. So there is a double punch of trauma in the departure from an abusive church. The expectation of rejection and shame that is inculcated while individuals are still members, and the anguish and pain members experience when they actually leave. But healing can begin in the midst of their pain. The healing is deep because their wounds are deep. The healing takes a long time because their wounding took a long time. But the healing does begin and grows with every step, every day, month, and year away from the place where they were welcomed as friends, but dismissed as enemies. And what a perfect note of hope and healing to end on. I truly hope that you've all hopefully gleaned some learnings, some insight from this conversation with Ken, and from the outros where you get to hear his words and writing from his book, In the House of Friends. And I'm so grateful for Ken for spending this time that he did with us. And thank you all for listening. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Project Hope podcast. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to subscribe and comment. You can always get in touch with me at jennifer-french.com. And please let me know any specific topics of interest. And of course, I'm always interested in your stories, whether you've left an organization of high demand, high control, or if you're an individual struggling with the knowing that someone you love is in such a situation. I am here for you. Think critically, take heart, and be free.